Good morning, everybody. And could I first of all apologize that I am not speaking in French. I think you should be delighted I'm not, because my French is so appalling. But it is with great pleasure that I'm here today in the beautiful city of Quebec. And also I would like to thank Daniel Roberge and all of his team who have very much encouraged me to be here and told me about the conference over the last 6 months. I was very excited in the green room, which is where I've been sitting, so I've been hearing things through translation, to hear the announcements from the minister. And very much, quite a lot of the work that I do is talking to ministers, talking to prime ministers, even there are 2 kings in the world who absolutely get geospatial now. And, you know, what we've seen with Anthony's talk, when he's talking and challenging us about having living laboratories and changing the cultures of the way we think, is really important. So over the next sort of 25 minutes, I'd just like to give you a little bit of a run-through of where I'm seeing how our information is really changing people's perceptions on what they can do with their economies and why it's getting the attention of such senior leaders around the world and changing, in many, many cases, how governments really decide to invest in this area. And it's excellent because now we're seeing all the innovation that so many of you are involved in every day, now absolutely getting, in many cases, hundreds of thousands more dollars, if not millions of more dollars, just by that increased recognition of how it really is affecting economies. Very much, it's about us getting our language right. And the phrase, everything happens somewhere, it's a phrase I coined a very long time ago after the head of the UK government's Treasury said to me, if I ever hear you talk about geospatial, geo-information, when you're trying to brief our Prime Minister and other things, please don't. And it made me realize that some of the words, some of the language we use is quite threatening, but when we absolutely look at how we underpin so much of the decision-making of our countries, then we can get our senior leaders to understand that if we use the right kind of language. Obviously, since 2005, our world has changed because whereas those who've been in the industry for longer than 2005, most people never knew what we did. It was slightly surprising to them. And certainly I have a relative in my family who had spent a very long time saying to me he can't understand how I've ever managed to exist because, you know, I'm not an accountant or a lawyer or something like that. And basically, all of a sudden, everyone started to get what we did when in February 2005, we suddenly had more universal mapping from the likes of Google and Microsoft and Yahoo in our fingertips. We've also seen major conferences taking our subject very seriously. And I was lucky enough to present at the Rio+20 conference to really help people understand that they couldn't measure and monitor sustainability without accurate location data. And various politicians got it. And various politicians who only had 5 minutes to give their speech absolutely inserted in their speeches in the last day before the big leader speeches. And we ended up in the outcome document with the words reliable geospatial information. And for many of us, we might say, well, it's in a document, I've never read it, does it matter? To governments, it does, because so many governments follow these outcome documents and they invest in what's in them. What we've also seen is large nations taking our industry very seriously. I'd like to thank Dr. Li, my opposite number in China, for these next couple of slides, because very much they have geospatial information within their 5-year plan. And, you know, this slide sums it up. Digital China plus geospatial monitoring plus geospatial information industry equals leading country. Well, that's just sorts it out, doesn't it? Absolutely, it summarizes that geospatial is at the heart of what countries are doing now. And then it leads to an explosion of an industry, an explosion of innovation. And what we've also seen is, in an example here in Australia, where absolutely it changed a political nightmare into a political success. Some of you remember in 2011, there were terrible, terrible floods. And during those floods, what became apparent was the government's policy could never work. Their policy was that the government would compensate the citizen if there was a certain depth of water within their house. Well, that works if there are 50 houses. A surveyor can go round and measure where the tide mark is very, very quickly. But when you've got hundreds of thousands of properties flooded, and everybody wants to start ripping up their carpets and getting the floodwater out, you can't wait for the definitive government statement on whether you had 4 centimetres or 6 centimetres in your house. So within literally less than 12 hours, a group of people got together and started to look at how could they assess this differently. And of course, they looked at the debris lines and instantly suggested that they publish those debris lines onto the website and said, if you live within a debris line, the government will compensate you. If you live outside, you must make a claim. And so it changed the administration burden. It also, everybody was looking at the website, and again, politically, it did the right thing. And what we saw was the government being now trusted in the way they were managing the floods, rather than there being huge antagonism against them. So very much, again, our industry came to prominence with politicians. Often it is about a big incident, a big issue. And sometimes also what we're seeing is governments deciding that they need to look at this strategically. In the case of Australia, they commissioned a report because Miss Gillard, who was the then Prime Minister, was keen to understand how the budget lines could be looked at spatially in order to make sure that the budgets of Australia were being evenly distributed. The reality, of course, was that they didn't have the data, they didn't have the coding, they didn't have the structure in place to actually do that. But the good thing is that they're moving towards some of that. Also, we're seeing countries investing highly in making 3D city models and making sure that they are at the hub of the digital world. And for many citizens, our industry is making a huge difference. In Rwanda, there had not been very much land registration, and the number of registered plots was low. It was 40,000 in 2009-10. Many people know that good land registration absolutely makes a huge difference to the loans that people are able to get and the future-proofing of any small or micro business they start. And so in Rwanda, they're using different ways and taking some of the excellent work that FIG's been doing on looking at different ways to do land registration going forward. This is an excellent example where they've been giving GPS kits to the locals to basically be able to describe their land and then checking a certain subset of them in order to make sure that by 2015 there should be 6.9 million land plots now registered. We heard from Anthony about having living laboratories, and I'm lucky enough to work in the Middle East for a considerable amount of the time, and Masdar City is one of them. Very much geospatial is integrated into every part of the city plan, making sure that whether it's in the construction, in the transportation, or in the monitoring, that absolutely geospatial is at the heart. But what's this taken? It's taken a visionary, a very strong leader, and excellent communication to make sure that everybody does what's asked of them. And it hasn't always gone well, but the reality is, overall, what we're seeing is geospatial information at the heart of everything that's going on. Going now to Rio, for those who were watching the World Cup, and for those who are looking forward to the Olympics, what you can be sure is I've visited the Rio Operations Center, and geospatial is at the heart of everything they do. And what's interesting is they're able to work together with the weather and climate colleagues, looking with the transport managers, because Rio is an extremely complicated city for transport, and extremely complicated because they have very, very instant weather events. But it does make a difference having geospatial at the heart of all their decision making. What we've also seen in Brazil is that the state of Amazonia really looking at how could they change crime patterns. And they too decided geospatial was at the heart of this. So as a result of an investment of 166 million Canadian dollars, they saw between 1 year and the next a 10% reduction in police incidents and a 13% reduction in murders. And absolutely, when you look in Britain, there is unbelievably a cost to each murder. And absolutely, if you multiply that by the amount that they've had, you can see why the cost-benefit analysis really works. Anthony talked about how cities are changing. And this is an example from Bahrain, where in Bahrain, absolutely, right up to the most senior leadership, they have got it that geospatial is transformational. And they've built their 3D city model. I was totally impressed to find they had about 6 minutes on the national news showing the 3D city model as the #1 thing on the news, because they wanted to make sure that citizens understood, A, how transformational this will be, and all organizations involved in infrastructure will use it, but also that it really would make a greater efficiency for everybody and help with then the innovation of the new apps that will be able to be developed. And this data is going to be freely available to everyone. Because that foundation data that they're building in Bahrain, rather like in Britain with my own organization, Ordnance Survey, what we're seeing is it's underpinning 99% of all other data. And by having a definitive, basically, foundation data, it basically allows people to make authoritative decisions. And for Ordnance Survey, over 3,300 organizations in the public sector in England, Scotland, and Wales use the data every day, and then there are tens of thousands of users in the private sector. Because it is all about authority. But authority doesn't need to come from government at all. Going forward, I think there are big questions for our industry about who provides authority. Here is, for those from Canada will probably recognize it, this is the master map of Great Britain of your embassy. We make 10,000 changes to the master map of Great Britain every day. And somebody was asking me last night, we do still have 350 field surveyors, and if it's a nice day and there's not much cloud, we'll have 7 planes flying Great Britain. But that authoritative data is from the government, but what we're seeing also is that there are many, many other sources, and that's important. And I do think the wisdom of crowds and how you put authority onto them is something everyone should be working towards. What we've got to be careful, though, is if it's not authoritative, we understand it's not authoritative, but it's often just good enough. It's just good enough for what's required. But just good enough does require some level of accuracy. Here's an example at point A. There should be an island. It's called the Isle of Jura. It's got a reasonably big population, but unfortunately it was missed off, which is a bit of a problem. But more importantly, if you go onto Wikipedia, you'll find there's a place called Argleton. And Argleton, there's nothing there. Unfortunately, in many, many mapping databases of informal nature, it says there's a town there. The reality is it's not. There is nothing there but fields, and the bottom picture is from Ordnance Survey very recently. And absolutely, it's about getting the information correct. It's also about what interpretation of information do you have. I was in Moldova last week for the UN. And, you know, one of the biggest issues was how were certain geographies in that area being depicted by certain mapping authorities. I say authority because that's what they were saying. But of course, I had to explain that they were depictions. And some of the big engine providers have been really, really subtle and have done a very good job, really, where they've got dotted lines saying border in dispute. If you're looking at it with one set of eyes and you're sitting in one country, and if you're sitting in another country, it says hard border, and that means that it now belongs to another country. So it's kind of quite interesting how these things are happening. Now, none of us can predict the future at all. Even Bill Gates found that he got it wrong. 640K RAM should be enough for anyone. The reality is, though, there are lots of studies to look to the future. One I draw your attention to is freely available on the web because it was done by the UN, and I've got a few hard copies, but not very many. Because it's from the UN, anyone, hold on, somebody opened the water and left the top off, that wasn't helpful. Anyone can basically take any of the information from there. It's available now in 7 languages, and it has been basically presented to over 50 cabinets in the last year around the world. Because what it does is give some broad trends. How was it created? It was created by the crowd. I wrote out to 150 of the best people in the world in different object areas and said, please only write 2,500 words, however expert you are, and please make sure that you use language that everybody can understand. And then we collated that into a short document for governments. So basically, we have them covering things like trends in technology, and many of these things you'll know, where everything is a geospatial beacon going forward. And very much what we're also seeing is that it's a sort of analysis, no, I can't say that word. Basically, it's going to feed all analysis going forward. Analyst, I think I meant to say. What we're also seeing is the huge growth in data and the demand for real-time data. That we are in a hyper-connected world. Now, this is all written in language that prime ministers and kings can understand. So if you've got senior decision makers, you might like to take some of the words, because it's from the UN, and if you come from a UN member state, you can, or you may want to also just show them the whole document. Talks about the cloud, explains the cloud. Talks about the value of open source and how open source is becoming transformational. I was working with 20 governments over the last weekend in Africa, and the one thing they said was, please, if a certain government wants to give some data, please, 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 can we absolutely have capacity building in open source, not in proprietary systems. We can't afford proprietary systems, and we cannot afford them even if they're gifted to us. Over time, the cost is too much. So it's interesting how these governments are taking these views. The move from 3D to 4D, very much UAVs, as Anthony talked about, and also how aerial and satellite imagery and microsatellites is changing our industry. Talked about how the next generation's GNSS will change things and how positioning is so important. But in this document, it also talks about how policy is changing, how often government data is free at point of use, how it's all about quality at the core, but ensuring governments understand that maintenance costs money. Because that is one of the key things. If you can't maintain the data, it's not worthwhile. Also, we talked about in this document the collaboration with the private sector going forward. I was with a huge national mapping authority last Friday, and basically over 2/3 of all their collection is now outsourced to some of the biggest providers in the world. But one of the things that is changing is the interest from the legal profession. The legal profession has suddenly got geospatial. And some of you may or may not know that the International Bar Association, which runs the lawyers of much of the developed world, and there are International Bar Association members in every country, they've taken an acute interest. But perhaps they need some help, because their acute interest is they want to have a geoinformation convention, and in that convention, they want every citizen of which anything flies over to give their permission. I don't think they've thought that through quite as much, but I'm lucky enough to be one of the people now dialoguing with them to basically talk to them about the benefits of what we do as opposed to the individual's right to privacy and things like that, which they are very keen on. One has to understand, I did actually ask, please tell me, why are you so interested in this? And they said, it's a brand new area of the law. So there we are. And also, where does liability lie? And basically, what are those boundaries going forward? One of the things we also looked at was skills, because we need different types of skills in our industry. We absolutely need geographers, but we need better understanding from computer scientists, cognitive scientists, human factors, just mentioned the law, web science, and many other areas. And what we're also seeing is the design world is playing such a big part in our industry to make sure that we can represent that data properly. At the same time, it's about every single one of us investing in young people and making sure that the new generations are attracted to our industry. I put up this slide because at Ordnance Survey, we had a physics student come on a 6-week secondment. And we say to our students, do what you like, really. We very much allow them to have a research laboratory think tank kind of attitude. And one of them this physics student took our open data and turned it into Minecraft. Well, I'll tell you, it went viral. And I was in a taxi about 10 days ago in London, and the taxi driver said to me, aren't you the person behind Minecraft having mapping in it? And I said, well, not me personally, really. And he said, oh, I saw you on the TV about it. And he said, my children, it's just transformational. So it's about us thinking differently. What also is about the role of governments going forward, because people do want to consume that data. They do want to be sure it's assured in some way. But the question is, does it need to be assured by government? Can it be assured by others? And the crowd really is changing things. And we've just seen that with the example from Rwanda and other areas. At the same time, we've seen some of our leaders of the world absolutely start to get really involved in data and the openness and transparency agenda, where they're talking about high quality open data, that data's fully described, release data as early as possible, increase open data literacy, and empower a future generation of data innovators. Well, in Britain, we had a strategy for the geospatial industry, which was written probably about 6 years before these statements were made. And they absolutely relate to each other. What we've been saying in geospatial for a long time, the governments are now saying. Why? Because there are fantastic return on investment stories now available. This is from the Welsh government, and they generated 899,000 Canadian dollars savings just in 1 year by looking at better address management. What we also see is geospatials underpinning some of the biggest events. This was the London Olympics. I was lucky enough to be the geospatial lead for both the civilian and military at the London Olympics, and other countries, and Canada was one of them, with whom we did very strong liaison. And we also came to learn from your Olympics beforehand, from the Winter Olympics. And geospatial was fundamental to everything we did. It was a 4.5-year project where we even mapped every water meter cover, which is this size by this size. And there were literally millions of them. And we mapped them within 7 square kilometers of the main stadium and 3 square kilometers of other stadia in order to save vast sums of money by being able to share that data with many other people. So the security services needed it, but politicians needed, where's something happening? What's happening? But at the same time, thankfully, there weren't any crises. The only real crisis was this one, which nobody got to know about just because it wasn't a crisis. It was the combination of the Meteorological Service and ourselves looking at a fire in a waste disposal unit, which absolutely the air quality could have been not able to run the Paralympic finals in Olympic Park. But thankfully the wind changed and they were able to go ahead. What we see, though, is governments all around the world now taking our subject very seriously. In Namibia, the minister talks to me and talks publicly how he used to talk about agriculture and water at the cabinet, nearly all the time. He said it was the main topic. And now, guess what? It's all geospatial, because he realizes it enables water, enables food management and food security. At the same time, what we're seeing is many private sector organizations using our data to make a difference to their business. Here's an example of a utility where the asset department believes it supplies those houses in blue. The billing department believes it's billing those in green. So those in red are getting free utilities. Very simple. But that simple analysis saved that particular authority 1.79 million Canadian dollars, and in just cutting their day-to-day working costs, $107,000. Obviously got very bad at my K's and my M's this morning. Sorry about that. What we're also seeing around the world, and I thank my colleagues from Landmetria in Sweden for these, is that it's transformational government systems. Here is real property assessment being done in close cooperation with the Swedish tax authorities and the Swedish mapping and cadastral and land registration authorities. And with a very transparent front end, making sure that people can see the information they require and being able to make sure they can describe and declare what's happening. What's interesting is now it changes what the citizen has to do. They are not having to make several different pieces of information to several different organizations, they're able to now inform in the way that's just simple. They inform once, and the government tells many times. Certainly in my own country, what we've seen is, for emergency management and response, major use of geospatial. Here is the cabinet, which was being chaired by David Cameron that day, and what we saw was the presentation of geospatial data, very much to underpin the decisions the Prime Minister wanted to make. Which houses have been flooded? What were the addresses? How can we intervene? How can we stop this? And that information was vital to the response the politicians and the emergency responders occurred. I put in the next two slides for a couple of young researchers I met last night who were talking to me about their use of radar. And absolutely we were using radar in order to be able to look at where the polygons ended and in the flooding. But it's happening all over the world, whether it be in China or whether it be in humanitarian assistance. As I think was mentioned, I'm a patron of the first responder network that comes out of Great Britain, together with Prince Harry. And basically within 24 hours, our mappers, all volunteers, can be anywhere in the world to help support things. They are in Liberia at the moment. They have been in Iraq in the last few weeks, very much providing humanitarian help to make sure that people understand, working with the UN, where are the affected areas, where are the affected people, and where are the access routes, and where are the relief teams and agencies, and where should they go? Because it is all about how can you measure and monitor, how can you manage this information if you can't map it? And what we see, whether it's in Indonesia, very, very simple mapping being done. This is provided by the Indonesian National Mapping Authority. They provided the words on the slide, and absolutely what they've done is some very simple mapping to now help people look at the hazards of floods and to be able to do the evacuation. What we've also seen is lots of people looking at savings and how can they generate savings. And here's an example where just on routing of rubbish trucks in Britain, they've been able to reduce the diesel costs by 12% and increase the spare capacity by 14%. And the same is going for routing of school buses, just changing literally for 2 school bus routes. They were able to make savings in a year of 287,000 Canadian dollars. Because as Anthony said, it's all about being smart. And whether it's smart cities or whether it's smart metering, what we're seeing very much is that there's huge savings to be made in the next few years. And it's all about our community. It's all about, instead of people looking at separate, disparate pictures, they're able to look at one common operating picture, and they have the same real-world information at the same time to make the right decisions. And Anthony talked a lot about Singapore. Just finally, what we've seen is the UN get involved. I'm lucky enough to have been invited to be the inaugural co-chair for a committee. We're the first committee to be set up by the UN in over 20 years. And why did it happen? Because it was thought there was a significant gap in the management of geospatial information globally. And as a result, there was a mandate given for 5 years until June 2016 for us to work together with member states to try to work towards making sure that the management of geospatial information is understood at Foreign Office level. And instead of us in geospatial saying, this is exciting, you must listen, Minister, I'll tell you, the UN is telling the ministers that it's an essential building block of countries. And more, I'm seeing ambassadors to the UN attending meetings and being part of things. And I'm chairing a set of ministers in 2 weeks' time in Beijing, and we have ministers from all over the world coming to be part of that. Why? Because they get it. And why do they get it? is because the Sustainable Development Agenda, which so many governments are following, absolutely, the Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information, we are an essential part. And as the Undersecretary General of ECOSOC said, absolutely everything revolves around location. So as a result, we have been engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we now have various papers involved in that, to make sure that people understand location assists in the measuring and monitoring. And if you get a consistent global network, you will make a difference to citizens. So people sometimes ask, what are the key things that countries should do? One is in geospatial, they should have strong governance. They should have standards. They should have capability and capacity building programs, and they should have spatial frameworks. I'm not going to go through all of those, but I just wanted to bring to your attention some stunning work done by ISO, OGC, and IHO, where at a request of mine, following a letter I received from the Mongolian Prime Minister that said, please, literally it was 4 lines long, and it says, "Dear Dr. Lawrence, we are doing work in geospatial. Which standards should we adopt? Your industry is very confusing. With best wishes." So as a result, it was in English, so it was a translation. So as a result, we got everyone together, mapped all the standards, and have come out with a guide and a companion document, all that's freely available on the web. So if you are an emerging country and you really want to get going on this stuff, you now know which standards to adopt. And then you can go into the more detail and the more technical later on. At the same time, we continue the work of looking at authoritative geospatial information being available at national, regional, and global levels. And one of the most exciting things is that we have over 90 countries at ministerial level who have all agreed that we need a global geodetic reference frame. So if we have national ones and regional ones, they will fit within a global one. The applications of this will make such a difference. Everyone will be talking about the same place on the Earth's surface. And you may be surprised to know that it's had so much traction that it has been decided that the resolution that was passed this summer is actually going to go for endorsement at the General Assembly, we hope, in December this year. Because what we see is innovation continues apace in our industry. But that innovation has to go with the commitment of all of us. It's not just about giving open data. I spend my life saying to governments, please stop throwing data over the fence. Please make sure that you're engaging with your industry, engaging with the professionals, so they can help communities absolutely to use that data to answer their big questions. What we're also seeing is a lot of work going on with young people, which is tremendously important. Because the future direction of everything we do, and I know people like Gavin will talk about this afternoon, is so changing. And we need to make sure we're part of that change and we are accelerating that change. But one of the things that we must be part of is some of these transformational changes. And certainly in the UK, we will be moving to smart metering into every home by 2020. And then if you think of authoritative data, which is the biggest application that needs that, is if we are going to have driverless cars, which certainly my government has said can be on public roads from January 2015, then they do need authoritative data. So with that, I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight into how the authoritative world that we work in, whether the authority is provided by government or from the crowd, absolutely is being transformational to economies. Thank you.